Welcome back. Today we'd like to look at the flood, Noah's flood, and we just need to remind ourselves what we're up to. We've talked about the world before the flood. We've talked about the world of Eden, that is. The water was in one place, a small ocean and a huge continent. Okay, and the whole world surrounded in a bubble. Of course, that's where most of the water that we see in our oceans now was, in this canopy or bubble that was suspended above the earth, and that's what kept it all as a tropical environment and changed so much of the environment and would make it unrecognizable compared to the world that we know now. Now, what's interesting is that the Bible allows us to actually fix a date for the flood as 1656. That's 1656 years after creation, or Anno Mundi as the Jews would use. And you can work this out from the dates and the genealogies in Genesis, where Adam lived for 930 years, so you can see a yellow line there for him. And then when he was 130, then Seth was born, and so you've got a line that's 912 long for him, and so on and so forth, and you can work it all the way down through the family tree until you come to Noah, who's born in 1056, and when he's 600 years old, that's when the flood comes. And so therefore the flood is in 1656. And so it's quite interesting to see that you can actually set a date for it. The other significant things that you see in this chart is, of course, that the earth is divided a couple of hundred years after the flood, and in fact the other outstanding feature is the fact that the lifespans come down. Before the flood they all lived for about 900 years, up to Methuselah, who was 969, and then after the flood you can see that their lifespans come right down from 950 for Noah, for example, down to 600, then 438, 433, and so you can see how the lifespans of humanity came right down, and we'll talk about the reasons for that as we go on. So what we understand here is that actually the bubble is burst. The earth is suspended in a bubble. What happens when you pop a bubble? Of course, we all know how it sort of splits and goes into droplets and then falls to the earth. And so you've got huge amounts of water pouring down in this deluge at various places on the planet, causing massive tsunamis. It would have destroyed anything that it hit, both on the point of impact and of course as it goes on. In the tidal waves you've got tsunamis, mud waves I would say, and of course there would be huge environmental changes, temperature changes, hurricanes, and indeed earthquakes, because of course the flood is also caused by the floodgates of the deep opening. So we don't know exactly what that was, but certainly something that was geological in its scope. And so therefore you're talking about huge changes in the flood. It's not just a case of rain. It's often portrayed as just being rainfall that came down and then caused floods. No, this was on a completely different scale. This was quite different. Okay, it would be obvious that during this, that actually much of the geology that we see around us, the layers of rock, would have been laid down in this time, and in fact, of course, all the animals being swept up in this, animals and trees, is where we end up with the fossils. And the fossil record is much more easily explained by huge floods, mudslides, earthquakes, and such like, than the stereotypical sort of illustration that I was brought up on, that animals died and floated to the bottom of the sea, and then sediment would slowly cover them as it was settling on the bottom of the ocean. Of course, actually that's impossible, because the animals would rot before they ever had a chance to fossilize, or they'd be eaten by scavengers, and nothing falls to the bottom of a pond without just rotting away and being destroyed. And actually the only way that animals can be fossilized is if they're buried alive. And in many of these graveyards there are so many animals, they're overlaying each other, they're twisted up with each other, they're caught in the middle of doing things like eating, and it's quite clear that these things have been destroyed in huge numbers very, very suddenly, which only fits the description of the flood. All right. It's also interesting to notice that the land as we've been calling it, Pangaea, as a continent, was divided later. We'll read about that in Genesis 10. So that's quite a different occasion, quite a different event, and that would result in different evidence. Okay, so with the flood being caused by the bubble being burst, of course, after the flood, we'd have a different environment, where before there were no seasons, probably no ice caps, and so no changing weather patterns. After the bubble is gone, totally different. First of all, most obviously, you've got direct exposure to space. That allows heat to escape. Once the heat of the sun has warmed up the planet's surface during the day, during the night the heat can just escape, and that's why there's changes in weather patterns and that kind of stuff, which wouldn't have happened before. Also, there would be no seasons before the flood, but now there are seasons. It's interesting that when Noah comes out of the ark, that he's told seed time and harvest will never cease, and so therefore there are seasons. There's changes that we just take for granted as everyday life. These are major changes, of course, and one of them is the fact that we would have weather, so we would have rain, which didn't exist before the flood. And what do you need for a rainbow? You need direct sunlight and you need rain in the atmosphere. And of course, before the flood, Noah had never seen a rainbow, and so when he came out of the ark, he saw a rainbow, and God said, "This is my promise that I won't flood the earth again." And of course, absolutely, that makes scientific true. It's not just a covenant, it's actually common sense when it comes to the science, because of course before the flood there was no direct sunlight and there was no rain, so you couldn't have a rainbow, but now you can. So actually it's one of the evidences that the Bible is not made up, because if the Bible had been made up by men, they would never have put in a detail like that, because they probably wouldn't have even known if man was sort of thousands of years ago, and sort of the way that ancient man is sort of portrayed as primitive man, as we've been discussing from the evolutionary portrayal of history. They would never have thought that rainbows never existed. Only God could actually put something like that in, because of course that is historically viable and scientifically. Of course, there would also be no ice caps before the flood, but now there are, so there are big changes, and that's why Noah has this explanation when he comes off the ark, about the weather and about the seasons. And so there's evidence here that there were ice caps only from the flood onwards. Of course, it's possible that after the flood there was an ice age. A lot of evidence which is looked at and seen as evidence of an ice age is possibly actually just evidence of the flood, but looking at the evidence, geology and archaeology, it's possible that there was an ice age. There are some evidences towards that. Okay, and also, as I mentioned, when we looked at the ages dropping, of course, that would quite possibly be caused by the change of environment, in particular, of course, radiation coming in from the sun, which before humanity was protected from. And so it's interesting how when you look at the ages, you see how they drop. When you look at this chart, you see how they actually funnel down towards the end, until you get to Joseph, who only lives for 110 years. And indeed, as we read a few centuries later, you've got Moses, who lives for 120, and it's seen as remarkable. In fact, in Psalm 90, Moses bewails the fact that he thinks he's going to die because he's 70 or 80 years old, and he thinks that's as long as people live. So clearly, by the end of this chart, 2,500 years after creation, then lifespan has come down to something that we would recognize as a normal lifespan today. Okay, it's interesting to see how that comes down. I mean, it may be not caused by the radiation, I don't know, but I think that seems to be the most obvious idea, the most obvious cause, given that the bubble has been removed. So after the flood, we now have a lot more sea. 3/4 of the world is now sea, and about 1/4 of the world is now land, dry land. Okay, so given that the continents actually fit together like a jigsaw. When you look at them on a map, you can see that for yourself. Then it's interesting to think that the Bible does say that all the land was in one place, and so therefore it actually supports that. And even until comparatively recently, last century or so, even the suggestion that all the continents were once together was poo-pooed, and now it's just accepted as a normal fact. It was rejected, and now it's actually standard, a standard fact. What is different, however, is that often they say that these continents split apart millions of years ago and that they're moving apart very slowly. Problem is, of course, they've been measuring the changes, and of course the changes actually happen quite rapidly. The continents are still moving, and they're moving quite fast, and it's not supporting the whole idea of it being millions of years. All right. So Pangaea is the name. It just means like the land mass that was actually just one continent. And we'll read in Genesis 10 how in fact the land was divided, and that would have been earth-shattering, if you can use that expression. Massive earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, big map-changing sort of activities, and happening with alarming rapidity. But as you can see, given that we're talking about an entire timescale from Adam until now of only 6,000 years, this happened within human history. This is not something that happened before man ever existed, as evolutionists would have us believe. And so therefore it explains how it is that there are cultural similarities between all these continents. For example, pyramids. It's interesting that you've got pyramids built in Africa, namely Egypt and Sudan. You've also got pyramids in South America, and you've got pyramids and the polygonal masonry that's used across all of these continents. Why? Because at one point, after the flood, all of these continents were connected, and as the people spread out from Noah's family, Shem, Ham and Japheth, there would have been an exponential rate increase in the population, and they took over all these continents in a matter of centuries. And then of course they were divided in Genesis 10. They were divided again, and so therefore these continents, which supposedly according to evolutionists haven't been in touch with each other for thousands upon thousands of years, actually they show similarities in their culture, and they all seem to have folklore that concerns a flood, a global flood, and it's quite remarkable. Remember the Ica stones, where it showed that the continents were close together, and it looks like America and South America and Africa on that stone. And so therefore you wonder, did they actually know that the continents were close together? Because that was created just after the earth divided, after that earthquake that created the Atlantic ridge. So before the flood, lots of land, only a little bit of sea, and then after the flood, lots of sea and only a little land, but only in one piece. Not until Genesis 10 do they get divided into the continents that we now know.